Montana Territory, June 1880. The wind carried smoke across the valley long before Florence Fairburn saw the flames licking up from the ridge where her cabin had stood for 5 long years. She dropped the pail she had been filling at the creek and ran heart-pounding, skirts snagging on brush until the clearing came into view. What was once her home was nothing but charred ruin now, a black skeleton of logs and ashes. The barn was gone too, and the corral gate hung open. Not a trace of her 3 milk cows or the 4 mules remained. "No," she whispered, stumbling forward, coughing against the smoke. No, 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 the air was thick and bitter. The garden she had worked herself near to death planting had been trampled. Her washtub lay split open on its side. The door to the root cellar was hanging off its hinges. They had taken everything. The fire hadn't been an accident. It was too thorough, too cruel. They'd waited until she left for town, just a half-day ride to sell her quilted goods and buy salt and flour. She had been gone barely 6 hours. A man's boot print in the mud near the barn, heavy and careless, confirmed what she feared. Raiders. Maybe drifters. Maybe someone she had once turned down at the saloon in town. Whoever they were, they had stolen her livestock and left her with nothing but soot and ruin. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to the dirt, fists clenched in the grass. Her shoulders shook, but she did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing. That night she slept under a pine tree with only her coat for warmth. The cold bit through the fabric and the stars watched in silence. Her rifle was gone taken. She had no food, no shelter, and no one left to ask for help. By morning the smoke had thinned, but the damage remained. Florence stood with dirt on her face and ashes in her hair, staring at what was left of her life. Then she heard the sound of hooves. She turned, squinting into the sun. A man rode toward her on a paint horse, tall in the saddle, his shadow long across the grass. He slowed as he came near, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on the butt of his revolver. His coat was dust-covered, his hat low over his eyes, and there was a quiet steadiness to him that made her straighten. He stopped a few paces away. "You Florence Fairburn?" "Yes," she said, voice hoarse. "Who are you?" "Osric Olander," he said simply. "I heard what happened." She stared at him. "From who?" "Sheriff in town. Said your place was torched, stock taken. I had a debt to repay to your father. Figured the least I could do was check on his daughter. My father died 3 years ago." He nodded. "Still owed the man." She folded her arms tight across her chest. "Well, you checked. I am alive. Now you can go." He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to a nearby tree without asking permission. "You have a place to go. I will figure it out," she snapped. "I always do." He crouched by the edge of the burned cabin, picking up a scorched horseshoe. "You will not last 3 nights out here with no food or firewood. I do not need your help." He stood again, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm he wore like armor. "I am not offering help. I am offering a solution." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of solution?" He looked her square in the face. "Marry me." The words hit her like a slap. "What? You need protection, a roof. I have a homestead 20 miles north, good land, 2 barns, cattle. I need a wife. You need a place to survive." "That is the truth of it." She took a step back. "I am not some outlaw," he said. "I do not drink. I do not raise my hand. I work. That is what I do. I will build you a kitchen garden and you can sow or not as you please. You will have your name on everything. And I will not touch you unless you ask me to." She blinked, stunned. "You want to marry me out of pity?" "No," he said quietly. "I want to marry you because you are still standing here after they burned everything you had. That is not pity. That is respect." Florence stared at him, her throat tightening. She had not heard words like that in years, maybe ever. "You do not even know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. "And I will learn the rest if you let me." The wind rushed through the trees again, and she felt the ache in her bones, the ache of too many years alone, too many nights cold, too many battles fought with no one beside her. "I will not be owned," she said. He nodded. "Then do not be." "Be a partner?" She looked at the ruins, then at him. Osric, a name she had never heard, a man she had never seen, offering something she never thought she would get again, a chance. "I want my own horse," she said. "And my own key to the house. You will have both." I will not sleep in a stranger's bed. Then I will build you your own room. You can burn it down yourself if I ever give you reason." She stared at him for a long time. Finally, she nodded once. "Fine," he nodded back. "We ride at first light." Before she could think twice, he walked back to his horse and pulled out a blanket and a tin of jerky. He handed them to her without a word. She took them, still watching him. He did not stare at her. He did not ask more than necessary. He simply sat on a log, rolled a cigarette, and waited for the sun to set. Florence ate in silence. And for the first time since the fire, she did not feel completely alone. When morning came, she was already awake, waiting by the stump with her satchel of salvaged thread and needles. Osric handed her the reins to a mare with a pale mane and said, "Her name is Clover." They rode north through the hills. It took them most of the day. His land was tucked between two creeks with a long wooden house and a fenced pasture. It was not fancy, but it was clean and solid. He helped her down, then led her inside and pointed to a door. "You can take that room. I will sleep in the hayloft until you say otherwise." She nodded once. "That will do," he nodded back, and for a moment they just stood there, two strangers bound by fire and necessity. But when she looked at him, something in her chest shifted. He had not saved her. He had given her away to save herself, and that meant more than any rescue ever could. Florence kept her boots on that first night. The mattress in the small back room was firm but unused, the air in it still scented with dry cedar from the planks above. She lay stiff beneath the quilt Osric had wordlessly left folded at the foot of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar creak of the house settling. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere out in the dark, a barn owl called once and then fell silent. By dawn, she was already up. The kitchen was plain but functional, wide stone hearth, hand-planed counters, a cast iron range with a stovepipe that drew clean. She lit the fire with kindling from the box, worked coffee into the pot with steady hands, and took inventory of the shelves without making a sound. The flour was fresh. The lard was stored well. She found dried apples strung in bunches along the pantry wall and a neat row of jars sealed with wax. Someone had taken care of this home. She had just set the coffee to boil when the door eased open and Osric stepped in, sleeves rolled, a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. His boots were wet with dew. He looked at her, not startled, not expectant, just taking in that she was awake and moving. "I brought eggs," he said, unwrapping the sack and setting it on the table. "Henhouse is on the far side. If the gray one pecks you, just push her aside." Florence nodded. "I've dealt with worse than a hen." He slanted his gaze toward the stove. "You cook. I can keep a man from starving. I'll take it." He moved to pour water into the basin and washed his hands without comment. She noticed then that one of his knuckles was split open, a thin red line against rough skin. "What happened to your hand?" "Caught it on a gate hinge yesterday. It'll close up." She didn't answer, just moved to the cupboard, pulled down a tin of salve and set it on the table. "Use that." He looked at it, then at her. "You always carry salve." "I made it. Pine, pitch, and bear grease. Works faster than brandy." He dipped 2 fingers in and applied it without speaking. When he was done, he slid it back to her. She made biscuits with the last of the sweet cream and fried the eggs in bacon fat. They ate at the table without much talk, the quiet between them full but not strained. After breakfast, he pushed back his chair. "Fence line needs checking. I'll be gone a few hours." She stood as well, wiping her hands. "Show me the barn before you go. I want to see the livestock." He studied her a moment, then nodded. They walked out together, the morning sun just beginning to warm the frost off the grass. Inside the barn, she counted 2 milk cows, a bull with a scarred flank, 4 calves in a straw-padded pen, and a team of draft horses with thick, steady legs. There were also pigs, 6 of them, and a trio of goats that watched her with blank-eyed curiosity. "You keep books?" she asked, squinting at the feed bins. "In my head." She gave him a look. "I know how many I got. I know how much they eat." Florence moved along the stalls, checking the water pails and the condition of the hay. "You built this barn with a neighbor. Took 2 seasons." She traced the beam over the tack wall. It was well joined, no gaps where wind could cut through. "Your neighbor's still around. Moved east last spring. His place is sitting empty now." She didn't say anything to that. Her fingers landed on a halter that looked new, leather still stiff. "Clover yours?" he asked. "She is now." Osric leaned against the barn door, arms folded. "You planning to stay on her back or settle in?" Florence turned to face him. "I don't know yet." He gave a slow nod. "Fair." He left after that, taking the trail north along the rise. She watched until he was out of sight, then set to work. By mid-morning, she had scrubbed the pantry shelves, sorted the root vegetables into baskets, and started a sourdough in the crock she found behind the flour sack. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. Around noon, she walked the perimeter of the house, noting the wear on the porch steps and the loose hinge on the storm shutter. The pump out back was solid, no creaks in the handle. She brought in 2 buckets of water and started a stew from the smoked venison she found hanging in the shed. When Osric returned, his shirt was damp with sweat and his hat pulled low. He handed her a coil of fresh wire and a pair of gloves. "South fence needs mending. I'll do it tomorrow." She took the wire without a word and set it by the door. That night after supper, they sat out on the porch. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, painting the sky with a red hush. Neither of them spoke for a long while. At last, he said, "You fixed the shutter." "I did." "Thank you," she nodded, arms draped across her knees. He tapped his boot once against the rail. "You always this quiet?" "Only when I'm thinking." "What are you thinking now?" "That you don't talk much either." He looked over at her, one brow lifting. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It's just the first thing we have in common." That made him chuckle, low and short. "We might find more." "Maybe." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, like a thread being tied, soft and deliberate. When the stars came out, she stood and said, "Good night, Osric." He tipped his head. "Good night, Florence." She went inside, her steps slow. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space, waiting to be filled. The first rain came 3 days after Florence arrived. It wasn't a storm, just a slow, soaking fall that darkened the earth and filled the eaves with steady tapping. She stood by the window with a tin in her hands, watching the drops bead on the glass. Across the yard, Osric was walking the fence line with his coat pulled high, hat low, shoulders squared against the wet like it was something he'd long since made peace with. She didn't call out to him. Instead, she dried her hands on her apron and turned back to the task she'd set herself to, darning the torn sleeves of the shirts he kept stacked beside the wash basin. His things were worn but cared for, patched in places with a firm hand, though not lately. He worked until the seams gave, it seemed, and then let them be. When he returned, soaked through, he didn't speak right away. He peeled off his coat and hung it near the stove, then nodded toward the table where she'd left a plate of cornbread and a bowl of boiled greens. "You didn't need to wait," Florence said, not looking up. "I wasn't sure if you were cooking for one or both." She laid the needle aside. "If I ever stop cooking for you, you'll know." He pulled out a chair, sat, and ate without rushing. She took the seat opposite him and began folding the shirts, setting each one aside with quiet precision. Between mouthfuls, he said, "You used to live near the Ruby River, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away. "I remember your father," he added. "He traded horses." Had a way of talking to them. Florence met his eyes then. "He said horses didn't care what you said, only how you stood while saying it." Osric nodded once. "That sounds about right." She pushed the stack of shirts toward him. He died slow. Took him nearly a year to stop breathing. "I was in Wyoming when I heard. By the time I got back, there wasn't much left of his place, just your name at the post station. He left me the land. I built what I could." Osric looked at her then, not with sympathy, but with something steadier. "You built more than most." Florence leaned back in the chair, arms crossed loosely. "Why did he help you?" He didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. That was rare then. She studied him in the lantern light, the way the rain slid down the panes behind him like strings of glass. "I suppose I don't ask many either," she said. "No, you don't." They stayed there, the warmth of the stove between them, the scent of wet earth drifting in through the cracks. Later, while she laid out her bedding, Osric stepped into the doorway of her room. He didn't cross the threshold. "I'm heading to the timber stand tomorrow. If you want to come, I could use a second set of hands." She looked up from the folded blanket. "What for?" Springs turned the lower edge to muck. Wagon keeps getting stuck. I was going to cut a plank path. Florence nodded. I'll bring the draw knife. He held her gaze a moment longer, then tipped his head and turned away. The next morning they left before the fog had lifted, Osric loading the tools while Florence packed a cloth of dried bread and smoked pork. The woods were thick with runoff, the air sharp with pine and damp moss. They worked in rhythm, Osric splitting the logs, Florence stripping bark, their voices quiet but steady when they spoke short instructions, shared glances, the occasional pause to drink from the canteen. At midday, while they sat on a stump to eat, he said, "You always worked the land alone," she chewed, swallowed. "Had helped my first year, a boy from the mining camp. He wanted to marry me until he saw how little I owned." Osric wiped his hands on his trousers. "He ever come back?" No, he didn't ask her name, didn't press. Instead, he picked up the hand axe and said, "If you take the south end, I'll finish the top edge." By late afternoon, the makeshift path was done. Florence stood back, rubbing the ache from her shoulder, and watched the wagon wheels roll smooth over the new stretch. Osric leaned on the shovel beside her. "That'll hold through summer. It'll hold longer if I come back in fall and tamp it again." He glanced over at her. "You planning that far ahead?" She considered that for a moment before replying. "I am now." They walked back in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed saying had already been laid between them plank by plank, word by word. That night she didn't close her door all the way. She left it ajar, just enough for the lamplight in the hall to spill across the threshold. Osric noticed. He didn't speak on it, but when he passed by on his way to the loft, his steps slowed. And when the wind pushed the door open a little farther in the night, she let it. The wheatgrass had started to yellow at the tips by the time Florence took to the ridge pasture with Osric's mule and a shovel slung over her shoulder. That morning she'd found a patch of earth near the upper fence slumping in, soft and sunken. Probably a burrow, maybe a spring underneath. Either way, it needed tending. Osric was down in the east field, mending the axle on his plow. She could hear the echo of his hammer even from here, steady and close to the ground, like a heartbeat through soil. She liked the way he worked, without complaint, without spectacle. Just got on with things. She dug slow, careful not to collapse the sides. When the hole opened to a pocket of damp clay, she stepped back and let the edge crumble. A rabbit tunnel, half-caved, nothing dangerous. With the mule grazing nearby, she packed the earth back in and tamped it flat with her boots. When she looked up, Osric was there. "You didn't call for me," he said, resting his hand on the mule's withers. "I didn't need to." He nodded and glanced at the fill. "You did it right." She brushed her palms against her skirt. "I know I did." They started down the slope together, not speaking for a while. The wind moved through the late summer grass in long, soft waves. "You always liked doing for yourself," he said at last. "I had to." "I know. Still, you've got a sharp way about you. It suits the land." Florence looked ahead, toward the house half glimpsed through the line of birches. "You ever think about leaving it, the land?" She nodded. Osric chewed on the thought for a moment. "Once, after my mother died, I went as far as Helena, slept 3 nights above a blacksmith's shop and heard nothing but iron and drunk men, came back the next week. Why? It wasn't mine. Not the way this is." They reached the barn and he pulled the mule's halter off with slow hands. Florence leaned against the stall rail, watching him. "You had people before this?" she asked. Osric didn't look up. "A brother, he fought for the Union." "Died in Missouri." "No one else. A woman once. She wanted a house in town, fine dresses. I never promised her that, but she waited like I might change." Florence didn't answer, just watched the dust rise from the mule's coat as Osric brushed it down. "You?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just one man who liked the idea of me more than the truth." "That's a hard thing." Florence leaned her cheek against the post. "I don't mind hard, I just mind being lied to." Osric set the brush down. "You'll never hear lies from me." She believed him. That evening, she brought out a jar of chokecherry preserves and 2 tin spoons. They ate on the porch, the sky deepening to lavender as crickets started in the grass. She handed him the last bite, and he took it without hesitation, mouth brushing the spoon like it mattered. "I was thinking," he said, setting the tin aside. "We could run a second row of beans next year down by the stone wall, more light there." Florence drew her knees up onto the bench. I saw that patch, it'll hold. You could sell dried beans in town. I could. Osric glanced at her sidelong. You want to? Maybe, he nodded. Then we'll plant extra. The quiet settled soft between them. After a while she said, You mean to keep sleeping in the loft? I don't mind it. I know, but I do. Osric looked at her then, a long, steady look. Florence met it without flinching. I've been thinking, she said. If you're still willing, I'd like you to come in. He didn't move, not yet. You sure? She reached for his hand. Yes, he rose, slow and sure, and followed her inside. No rush, no fever, just the solid weight of trust, hard-earned and fully given. That night the wind blew through the birches and the house held warm. No doors between them now, no distance left, only what they chose to build together. By the time the first frost curled along the fence posts, the house had changed in quiet, certain ways. The extra room Florence once slept in now held bolts of unbleached muslin, a rocking chair she'd bartered for with last season's preserves, and a growing stack of patchwork she was sewing through the long, cooling nights. Her needles stayed sharp. Her hand stayed steady. Osric had built a wood shed against the east side of the house, and each morning she found it a little fuller than the day before. They'd never spoken on it, but she noticed the way he split the logs smaller now, easier for her to lift when he wasn't home. On a gray afternoon in late September, a knock came at the front door. Florence wiped flour from her hands and opened it to find a woman standing there with a boy of about 9, both wind-blown and blinking against the chill. The woman's bonnet was frayed with travel and the child clutched a folded letter in his hand. You're Florence Fairburn, the woman asked. I am. I'm Clara Hensley. This is my nephew, Illy. He's yours now. Florence looked from the boy to the woman, then down to the letter. She took it and read the name at the bottom. It was her sister's. Clara's voice was quiet. Your sister passed in August. Fever took her quick. She wrote this just before. Florence stood still for a long moment, then looked at the boy, who hadn't moved. Come in, she said. Osric arrived home after sundown to the sound of voices inside. Florence met him at the door, her hands still damp from washing. I have a nephew, she said simply. He stepped inside, took one look at the boy curled on the edge of the hearth with a biscuit in his hand, and removed his hat. What's he called? Illy Hensley. His mother was my sister Beth. Osric nodded. He's staying, if he wants, she said, but he has no other place. Osric crouched beside the boy. Do you like horses? Illy nodded. You know how to feed them. Another nod. Osric stood and looked to Florence. Then he's home. There was no ceremony to it. Just a cot built in the wide space beside the stove, a quilt laid out, a place at the table set without fanfare. Florence showed Illy how to oil the hinges on the barn door, how to hang the kettle to catch the best light for warming cider. Osric gave him a pocket knife and taught him how to tie a fence loop that wouldn't slip under wind. Illy didn't speak much, but he watched everything. And slowly he began to follow. One morning in October, Florence found him sitting in the garden with the hoe across his knees, staring at the frost-laced leaves. You miss her, she said, crouching beside him. Illy didn't answer. Florence reached into her apron pocket and handed him a small wooden spool. Your mother used to help me so when we were young. She never stitched straight, but she always picked the brightest thread. The boy turned the spool in his hands. She'd be glad you came here, Florence added. I am too. He leaned against her then, just slightly. She placed an arm around his shoulder. Later that week, Osric brought home a second mare, wiry and quick, with a pale star on her forehead. For Illy, he said, handing the reins over. She's called Fern. Gentle enough to learn on. Illy ran his hand along the mare's neck with something close to wonder. Florence stood beside Osric at the edge of the corral. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. But I wanted to. She looked at him, the way the wind moved his collar, the quiet in his eyes. That night, after Illy had fallen asleep beside the fire, Florence pulled a folded paper from the drawer and handed it to Osric. What's this? He asked. Deed, she said. I filed it last week. Your name's on it now, mine too. He held the paper for a long time before meeting her gaze. You trust me like that? I live with you. I wake beside you. If that's not trust, I don't know what is. He set the paper aside and reached for her hand. I'd give you the deed myself if I'd thought it'd matter to you. It does, she said, but only because it's ours now. The snow came early that winter, soft and thick. They spent the season close, with stew warming on the hearth, Illy carving small animals from wood scraps, Florence finishing a quilt bright with reds and golds, Osric mending tack by lantern light. On the first morning of the new year, Florence stepped outside to find the world stilled under white. She turned to see Osric standing in the doorway, a shawl in one hand. "You left this," he said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I wanted to feel the cold." "Why?" She looked out at the trees, heavy with snow. "To remember what it's like to be held warm after." He stood behind her, arms around her waist. "You'll never be cold long again." She leaned back against him. "I know." Inside, Illy was stirring, the smell of buckwheat cakes rising. They went in together, Osric holding the door, Florence brushing snow from her hair. The house was full now, not just with warmth, but with belonging. Later that morning, Osric took a small ring from his coat pocket. It was plain silver, the band smooth and worn. "My mother's," he said. "If you want it." Florence took his hand, slipped the ring on, and said simply, "I do." They married that spring by the creek that cut through the back pasture. No preacher, no crowd, just a witness stone and the wind in the sweetgrass. Osric carved their names in the cedar post by the gate, and Florence planted sunflowers along the path. Through the years, they built more. A second barn, a smokehouse, a schoolhouse in town where Florence taught 3 days each week once Illy was old enough to ride on his own. He grew strong and sure, like the soil he was raised on, and when he called them Ma and Pa, it settled something deep and quiet in both of them. They grew old on that land, together. And when the wind came sharp off the ridge and the nights stretched long, they held each other close and felt no cold.